After a 13-month inquiry, today detectives took a female healthcare worker into custody on suspicion of murder. Cheshire Police say that the inquiry so far has been highly complex and very sensitive. And whilst today's developments are a significant step forward, the investigation is still very much active and ongoing.
The best thing that the families can hope for now is to get the truth about what has happened to their children, and the police are the best people to find that.
Confirmation bias is something that we all have as human beings. If we have a theory about something, we'll generally only gather evidence to support that theory, that view. And we tend to reject evidence that doesn't fit with our theory. There are massive potentials for damage in police investigations if an inquiry is affected detrimentally by confirmation bias. It's addressed in the document called the Core Investigative Doctrine of the Police Service. There is a whole chapter about confirmation bias and other biases such as anchoring, groupthink, etc. All of which I think, came to play at some stage within Operation Hummingbird.
It's really important to remember that there's still a long way to go in this inquiry and a lot of work before we're able to fully ascertain exactly what happened to these 32 babies subject to this investigation. And we are committed to a thorough investigative process.
Having been the national lead for the investigation of healthcare deaths, having written the addendum to the manual in terms of the guidance for healthcare deaths, having been the national lead for investigative interviewing, I was just really concerned about if, as my suspicions were, that this was an ineffective investigation and this person had been sentenced to 15 full life sentences. That was probably one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice I could think of. It certainly happened during my lifetime.
When Lucy Letby was first arrested and the material that came back into the investigation room at that time, we just, minds blew. It was like, wow, this is her life.
In Lucy Letby's house, police found a diary and pages of scribbled notes. Detective Superintendent Paul Hughes would later reflect on the woman he investigated.
I think, to reuse her own words, she is evil and she did this. And in my view, she wrote it down and left it for us to find. She knew the police were investigating Operation Hummingbird. And for me, she knew at some point we were going to be speaking to her. She wrote it down for it to be found.
I can understand why somebody might look at this and think, crikey, this might be relevant. She's an idiot. What they didn't do was to get any professional assessment of that.
When she was brought to the police station, she would have been told again why it was that she'd been arrested and what was going to happen, and she would have been informed that she could make a phone call to a family or friend. I would imagine she would have made a phone call to her parents, and she would have been also told that she had the right to free and independent legal advice. If she didn't have her own solicitor, then they could call one on her behalf, which would be the duty solicitor. There is a very varied quality of solicitors that are available. It can be a bit of luck of the draw.
Criminology lecturer Lulu Minns was originally a criminal defence solicitor.
The first interviews were some of the most difficult interviews she had.
Can you introduce yourself again for me, Lucy, please?
Lucy Letby.
Because a lot of them were about the so-called confession and admission that she had made. Lucy was attempting to, and I think she did pretty well, explain the stress and the anxiety she was under throughout the internal investigation at the hospital.
Okay, Lucy, I am really concerned about what you've written down and what you've implied you might have done. Anything you want to tell us?
Just wrote it because everything had got on top of me. It was when I not long found out I'd been removed from the unit. I felt like being blamed in my practice that I might have hurt them without knowing through my practice. That made me feel guilty.
For someone who's a young professional and the magnitude of the allegations that were being made against her, she'd been removed from the unit. She just got a mortgage and bought her first property. She wasn't able to speak to her colleagues.
I was blaming myself. But not because I'd done something, because the way people were making me feel. I felt like I'd only ever done my best for those babies, and then people were trying to say that my practice wasn't good or that I'd done something, and I couldn't cope.
In the early stages of her career, her competence being questioned at best, and at worst, her being accused of deliberately harming young babies that were in her care. I can't imagine the stress that you would feel being accused of that.
In terms of overwhelming fear and panic, what were you afraid of?
That people are going to think I had done something wrong.
Okay, and what would happen if they thought that?
This would happen. Police would get involved.
And is that what
I'm
happens?
losing my job.
And was it a job that you enjoyed?
Yeah, I loved my job.
At the University of Chester, our teaching will help you develop the resilience and self-worth needed to navigate your future with confidence in a world you can change for the better.
Just 6 years earlier, Lucy Letby graduated from Chester University. One of her tutors, Ruth Saddick, had provided a glowing reference for her job at the Countess of Chester. She described Lucy as competent, committed, amiable, motivated, and enthusiastic.
She said she was really passionate and had found her interest in neonatal nursing and that she'd be an absolute asset to any team that she was part of.
Join a community that shares your ambition and get world ready.
But Ruth had noticed something else about Lucy. She was painfully shy and, specifically, introverted when anxious. Few things could induce anxiety more than being interviewed by the police for murder.
My understanding is that she was referred to occupational health and counselling when she was removed from her job as a nurse, which she found extremely distressing. Their advice was for her to write down her emotions and process what was happening to her within the hospital.
Police naming me. Obviously no evidence and would have been spoken to, but still upsetting. I really can't do this anymore. I just want life to be as it was, and I want to be happy in the job that I loved and a team that I felt a part of. Really, I don't belong anywhere. I'm a problem for those who do know me, and it would be much easier for everyone if I just went away. Please help me. Please help me. Help me. No one will ever understand or appreciate what it's like. Someone help me.
She was emotionless. She cooperated, she answered the questions, she was clinical. Yeah, this is somebody that's never been involved with the police before in her life. And she's arrested for murder. And at no point did she appear to be struggling with anything. She was quiet, she wasn't obstructive, but she answered the questions, she dealt with everything.
We were sort of saying, can you imagine, I'd be screaming and shouting and...
Where's the banging on the tables?
Again, this is just nonsense. This is, I don't mean to be rude to people, but it's psychobabble. I mean, what qualification has anyone got within Operation Hummingbird to draw any assessment, to make any inference whatsoever as to the significance of her behaviour?
Police are not behavioural analysts, and if they want to analyse behaviour, they have experts that they can call in and do that, and it's far better to do that than do that themselves.
How is anyone expected to behave, particularly a person of Lucy's profile, her age, her background, her profession, how something like that's supposed to act? And what would they have said? She had been banging the table and aggressive.
Certainly, if a woman was doing that, as all the other labels would come in, that she's unfeminine, she's aggressive, she's, not behaving as she should do. It's not something that people tend to do in police interviews at all. 9 times out of 10, if they're innocent and also they've never been arrested before, they're entirely compliant. That's how they behave.
There's no basis upon which these inferences can be drawn by trained psychologists, let alone police officers with no background in psychology. I'm just astonished that somebody in that position would make those sorts of statements. They're naive and they're inappropriate. That's not evidence. That's speculation that's got no basis in anything that can be sustained.
And then do you think then you've got the right person? You must think that's...
I was sure at that point...
Yeah.
At the first point of arrest.
So I was sure that if it was somebody that had done it, she was the only one who could have done it. So we were still open-minded because we hadn't yet received evidence from the radiologist. We hadn't yet received information from the pathologist or the endocrinologist or the hematologist. So we had one expert's evidence at that point. If we confirmed inflicted harm, that she was the only person that could have done it, yes. But was I certain of inflicted harm? 100% I couldn't be because we still had inquiries ongoing. Very confident of inflicted harm based on the evidence we had so far. Yes, I was.
The police bailed Lucy and got to work finding experts besides their long-retired paediatrician Dowie Evans. He had gained a lot of work having offered his services to them.
It's that simple to do.
Right at the start of the investigation, the National Crime Agency had suggested an independent panel of different disciplines. Ex-GP Phil Hammond has written on medical cases for Private Eye since 1992, and he sees critical gaps in the skill set of the new Hummingbird experts.
It's ludicrous looking at neonatal deaths without having a maternity expert. In the panel for Letby, they would have needed an obstetrician. They would have needed a midwife, you'd have needed paediatric pathologists, etc. They had some of the makings of a multidisciplinary team, but it certainly wasn't complete, and it certainly wasn't independent.
The Court of Appeal, in turn, say that the subsequent experts were appointed on the recommendation of Dowie Evans, so these are people who presumably he knows. What they were actually asked to do was to give a view as to whether Dowie Evans had got it right, not look at these materials and tell us what you think the cause of death or injury is.
Controversial Cheshire Police and controversial Dowie Evans had an uncanny knack of picking figures that would themselves prove controversial. Neonatologist Martin Ward-Platt had helped convict an innocent mother, Angela Cannings. He had passed away, so their biggest new recruit was another neonatologist, Sandy Bowen, a partner in a healthcare monopoly on Guernsey. She ended up resigning in 2025 after complaints about her practice by 28 families. And Lucy Letby's jury never heard that the General Medical Council were investigating multiple and wide-ranging concerns about Professor Peter Hindmarsh's practice on the same day he first gave evidence in her trial. He would eventually remove himself from the GMC register, which stopped the investigation.
What's interesting, I think, about the way that they use experts is that with a lot of the experts, they don't say, don't look at these cases with fresh eyes. They say, Dr. Evans has reported on these. We'd like you to offer your view on Dr. Evans. And this is where the issue is, that I don't think they go into it particularly thoroughly. They say, well, Evans has written this. He's probably right. He's been around the block a few times. We'll sort of rubber stamp this without going into great detail about plausible alternatives.
While Cheshire Police were fixated with Operation Hummingbird and its many murders at Chester Hospital that may not exist, the senior coroner's officer whose report helped kickstart it had become concerned they may have missed a very different, real serial killer. Following up concerns expressed by her predecessor, Stephanie Davis had looked into 2 murder-suicides in Wilmslow in the 1990s. US police specialists on staged crime scenes independently agreed with her analysis that the cases had the hallmarks of a single killer. With Cheshire Police still focused on Hummingbird, the coroner's officer says she got their verbal permission to contact more experts for further input into her report.
Now, this UK-based expert then leaked my updated report to the Sunday Times without my knowledge or permission.
Stephanie found herself echoing the words of Lucy Letby after she had been removed from her unit in 2016.
I was happy for the police to come. I had nothing to hide.
I was completely open and honest, said I've got nothing to hide. And I know that there's going to be an article in the Sunday Times. Cheshire Police told me that my job was safe, that I didn't have to worry that they're going to put down the leak to professional learning. But that changed as soon as the article was published.
A report compiled by Stephanie Davis, a Cheshire coroner's officer, and leaked to the Sunday Times, suggests the deaths could be the work of a serial killer.
She's passed that report now to Cheshire Police, and Cheshire Police have confirmed last week that they are reviewing, in light of new evidence, they are reviewing the contents of that report.
It went crazy. And Cheshire Police then turned on me and they said, we're putting you under formal investigation. And I was like, hang on a minute. The only thing that's changed is that the media have taken my concerns seriously. You said my job was safe. It was Wednesday morning, knock on the door, and there they were, 6 police officers. I had no idea that they were going to then... There's going to be 6 police officers in my house, searching my bedroom, you know, taking my private diaries and eventually using that against me.
In June 2019, Cheshire Police made a decision to arrest Lucy Letby for the second time. She was now living with her parents in Hereford.
I understand that after her first arrest, she was released on bail and she was signing on at a police station. You can wait till she turns up at the police station and just invite her in and conduct an interview there.
Cheshire Police had other plans. They would later decide that traumatic footage of Lucy being arrested in bed at her parents' house, never used in court, would be Netflix exclusive.
Netflix is an entertainment company. To hear the distress of Mrs. Letby, you know, Lucy's mother, I think is absolutely, it's horrifying. And I think everybody involved in that should be ashamed of themselves. The police officers who gave that material to Netflix and Netflix who broadcast it. I think it's an absolute disgrace.
In another controversial decision, this time the police interviews were conducted by a family liaison officer, Danielle Stonier.
I would question using somebody whose job was to get very, very close to the families, to understand the families, to provide the families with support in terms of the investigation, whether that was an appropriate person to then go in and speak to the suspect in relation to the death of that family's child. A lot of people are clearly operating at a very emotional level within Operation Hummingbird. I would have made sure that the interviewing officers were separate, were properly trained, properly briefed, and were able to deliver that interview. So I'd be really interested to see why the decision was taken to use that officer.
The ultimate objective for interviewing Lucy Letby was all about getting the truth as to what happened to these babies and ultimately provide her with ample opportunity to give an alternative explanation as to why these babies rapidly fell so ill or did collapse.
As you can see, the red light has come on. This interview is also being visually recorded and monitored upstairs.
Could she have told us something that we were going to go, all right,
Oh,
okay,
right, that makes sense.
let's
Off we
go
in
and
a
tell
different
the experts
direction.
that then.
Yeah.
Go on then, Lucy, you're a good nurse, you tell us what it is.
It's not surprising, is it, that a nurse would not know the forensic detail of why a baby died, the medical reasons why a baby died. So they're asking a nurse, who's not a doctor, to explain what the cause of death is, and then drawing from that an inference as to a guilt because she wasn't able to give a proper explanation.
She was calm, she was engaging, and when talking about the processes involved in the care of these babies, she knew the answers to the questions.
So who takes the notes during the resuscitations?
Ideally, you would have a scribe there, so it's usually one of the junior doctors would take on, or one of the nurses would take on the scribing role.
But when she was challenged over certain points, particularly her actions around the time of the collapses, I think she did become slightly more evasive.
Is it a suggestion that she's guilty because she can talk all day about general things, but actually when you ask her specifics about things that happened over 2 years ago, she takes more time and often can't remember things?
She would spend some time thinking about a reply and would almost leave it what felt like a significant amount of time before answering.
Are you aware of why you required resuscitation?
No, I don't recall the events leading up to that. I just know that he had resuscitation.
So this understandable response has been, again, given a negative spin.
Just prior to the collapse, Lucy, had you had any cause to go into nursery one at all?
I don't remember.
Right. Were you working in nursery one?
I don't think I was, but I don't recall which baby I was looking after.
Okay.
It's a nonsense to then use that to infer that she had some guilty knowledge around it.
As well as diaries and notes, police had recovered hospital handover sheets going right back to her student days that are not supposed to be taken home. 257 of them.
Which had been stored in a chronological order, so in date order.
Yet the court was told that these were found in multiple bags, including bin bags in the garage. Netflix subscribers heard that some were found in a box marked keep. But they didn't hear that there were only 5 in there, none of which related to the babies that would end up on the indictment.
In total, there were 257 of these notes, and within them, just 21 related to babies who were subject of the indictment. So what are we expected to infer from that? That these were trophies, as they've been described, but in order to hide the trophies, she brought home over 230 other notes to sort of, insert them.
Many nurses say that taking notes home in a pocket was very common. And knowing that they should be disposed of securely, some might procrastinate and let them pile up. As Lucy herself would say in court,
I move paper around my whole life. I have difficulty throwing anything away, and I've got copious amounts of paper, cards, notes, and these are no different. They're just pieces of paper that I've gathered, and I've never done anything with them.
From our point of view, she was documenting the baby that got attacked on that day.
while only 21 notes relate to any of the indictment babies at all, things really fall apart on examining this further claim that they were on days of the alleged attacks. In his closing speech, defence barrister Ben Myers revealed that almost half of that tiny proportion were from different days.
In the context of the prosecution as we now know it, it's entirely consistent with the way in which the investigation was being taken forward. You know, these inappropriate assessments being made, fueled by what appears to me to be a developing atmosphere within the investigation around confirmation bias.
Have you previously taken any of these handover sheets home and disposed of them?
No, I didn't. I haven't got a shredder, and that's how I would have to get rid of them.
During the police searches, we found a shredder in one of the bedrooms at her home address.
In court and on Netflix, this was presented as devastating proof. Lucy Letby was a liar.
Our memory doesn't work on a linear timeline. You know, we remember snippets of things and we kind of put things together.
Academic studies confirm something most of us instinctively know, that stressful situations can critically impact memory.
When we're going through an experience that is so stressful, as she had been at this point for, I think, 4 years, 3 or 4 years, we're going to forget little things. Anyone who's gone through a divorce or lost somebody or, as I've said, had a toxic work situation that's happening, we can start to forget really simple things that happen.
Lucy would testify in court that in fact she did buy a shredder when she bought the house, over 3 years before her 2019 interview, and having moved back in with her parents after her first arrest, she had not lived there for nearly a year.
Whether you remember you've got a shredder or not, how is it evidence that you might be a murderer? But it's another part of this piling on of things that in themselves don't prove you're a murderer, but it's suggested that, by volume, they do make that suggestion.
In total, Lucy Letby would be interviewed for 23 hours. Stephanie Davis recalls her experience being interviewed under caution by the same team.
When it started, my solicitor had said to me, just say no comment. And I was like, but I want to talk. I've only got the truth to tell. And even one of the interviewing police officers said, Steph, we can tell you want to talk. We can tell, but it is okay to say no comment. That is okay. Because I felt awkward saying no comment. But as I got all these questions fired at me, I could see the direction it was going in. And I could see that they have determined that I'm guilty, that I'm bad. They're not even listening to me. They're not even, taking into account anything I've said in my defence statement. They're not looking at the exculpatory evidence that I've produced. They've ignored all of that. And their line of questioning was at times unethical. This is what you wrote in your diary 5 years ago. You wrote this, blah, 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 blah. That means that you weren't thinking rationally when you wrote your Wilmslow report. Really? What qualifies these detectives to suddenly give psychological opinion? That's wrong. And so when I saw the direction it was going in, my no comments were like more no comment, and I was getting angry. To see that in Lucy, when she started saying no comment, I thought she has had all these questions fired at her. She's answered them truthfully time and time again. and then they're just not listening. They're firing the same thing, but you did it. You're guilty. You did it.
No comment.
What the police are not permitted to do is rehash the previous questioning on the evidence and the facts that they've already put to the client before. So often the advice will be to not answer those questions.
No comment.
And often I might be giving advice to a client even prior to that interview. You've already given your account. Let's not answer any more questions.
Lucy, if there is an explanation for why you are responsible, now is your final opportunity to explain why this is to us. No comment.
You could see her starting to comprehend, starting to understand where this evidence was pointing towards.
No, she was sick of how biased you were being. You were being incredibly biased and you weren't seeking the truth. You know, I don't know who thought of that interview strategy, and I know I'm not a police officer myself, but I thought it was pretty piss poor. Excuse my language.
For a considerable time, I was the national lead for investigative interviewing, so I have an insight into the way that interviews should be put together. Yes, it's right to ask the questions. Yes, it's right to record the responses. The problem arises when you start getting these uninformed, and they must be uninformed because I'm not aware that these officers have got any psychological training, these uninformed assessments about her response, about her behaviour.
Again, Lucy Letby was released on bail. But while the investigation continued at pace, one person doing nothing was Jane Hutton, the statistician they had contracted for her specialist expertise. She was mindful of a past life-destroying disaster where Cheshire Police and Statistics were involved. But by December 2019, she still had none of the information she had requested.
I get told that they're waiting some results from a few further medical experts before asking the Crown Prosecution Service for charging advice. But by that stage, I'd already been approached by Peter Green, who was the Royal Statistical Society president, who highlighted the problems with the statistics used by Roy Meadow in the Sally Clark case. He was pretty worried about seeing the same mistakes being rolled out yet again. I was the chair of the Stats and the Law Committee. I was approached by really quite a large number of statisticians saying, we need to do something about it. I was in the awkward position of having a non-disclosure agreement. I couldn't actually get involved directly. Fortunately, Peter Green very kindly agreed to lead on writing a report about how you would tell whether something was a coincidence or a serial killer.
Professor Richard Gill was one of those who had got in touch.
I'm coming from the Netherlands.
He had given evidence which had helped to overturn a nurse's wrongful conviction in his own country.
This is Lucy de Berg, the nurse. She finally was exonerated of terrible crimes. You cannot send people to jail on the basis of circular, stupid, idiot arguments, which are totally obviously flawed. It was totally clear. The judges knew absolutely for sure that she'd done it, but there was absolutely no evidence for it, and they couldn't even write a straight story.
We know that investigations were going on at the Countess of Chester, and we rapidly knew that police were interested in a nurse. So we knew there was a spike in deaths, and the suggestion that a killer nurse was the cause of it.
The RSS commissioned a crack team to give definitive statistical advice to investigators on determining whether a healthcare serial killer was real or a phantom. They had eminent statisticians Peter Green and Richard Gill.
Then we had two lawyers, Neil Mackenzie, QC, and Bill Thompson is a very successful and serious senior academic in the legal field. Later, we often had Zoom meetings with him, and he was in his yacht, which was sort of sheltering from a storm somewhere off the coast of California, stuff like that. And Julia Mortera is another professor of statistics. I worked with her on another nurse case, Daniela Poggiali, and we actually gave evidence in the trial. She was exonerated, but in Italy, the prosecution has been able to appeal 3 times. So it took 3 more years before Daniela was definitively exonerated. When you only tell part of the truth, that might actually be telling a big lie by what you've omitted.
With Jane Hutton unable to begin on the case itself, the crack squad of statisticians from around the world got to work. There was no time to lose. For their critically important advice to be any use in the Lucy Letby trial, their report had to be out before it began, which meant stormy Zoom meetings.
Shit.
But it turned out that working over Zoom was about to catch on in a big way for everyone.
Our headlines today: a second national lockdown in England to last for a month. It comes in response to fears that the rising coronavirus cases could overwhelm hospitals.
I'm afraid from Thursday, the basic message is the same. Stay at home, protect the NHS, and save lives.
3.5 years after Operation Hummingbird began, on November 11th, 2020, Cheshire Police decided they couldn't wait another minute. At dawn, they arrested Lucy Letby for the 3rd and final time.
She had answered a bail, as far as I know, on all occasions. She'd signed on. What, again, was the rationale for doing it? And particularly during COVID and all the risks that there would be to going into premises, the risks to her, to her family, to police officers in doing that at a time when we thought that that was a risky thing to do. Wouldn't it have been better just to contact and say, look, Lucy, can you come down with your solicitor at a particular time, put all the relevant protective measures in place around the COVID issue and do it that way? Far more responsible way to do it than, again, to go through this, I have to say it, this apparent performance in terms of, the dawn raid almost.
After the 3rd set of interviews, Lucy is charged and remanded in custody.
When she was taken to the magistrates' court, she'd be taken to court in custody, brought up to the courtroom from underneath the court building. It is really not a pleasant experience. The only legal funding for criminal defence is through local high street firms, all massively underfunded.
Perhaps you want to put your affairs in order. You need help on the road to recovery. You've been arrested or face a court appearance. Our vast bank of skill and knowledge covers conveyancing.
When you're dealing with people in front of the courts all the time, they tend to have their own solicitor to represent them, and particularly people they like to represent them. When people of good character, their choice tends to be the duty solicitor, and they tend to keep that duty solicitor with them throughout the proceedings.
Lucy appeared in the dock wearing a grey jumper and grey jogging bottoms, and she waved to her parents in the dock and lip-synced "I love you" as she was remanded in custody after an application for bail was refused.
Given the seriousness of her charges, there would have been a strong presumption against bail. Lucy had spent her last night as a free woman. Her trial was still 2 years away.
That would have had massive implications for her mental health. It would have had significant implications for her ability to properly brief her defence team. I've been involved where people have been charged with very serious, violent offences and have been on bail until their court date. She had been on police bail for a considerable period of time. She'd always turned up and signed on. Why could she not have been on court bail and signed on even daily to ensure that she was still available? I wonder whether it was something to do with the fact that this almost social hysteria of this terrible thing having happened. This sort of person can't be released. They've been charged with these horrendous offences. They must go to prison.
With the trial set for the following year, in June 2021, a meeting about those all-important statistics was finally arranged between Jane Hutton and Cheshire Police.
And then 3 days later, I got an email cancelling the meeting.
The CPS's own guidelines indicate that they cannot give an instruction to a police officer or an investigation to do or not do anything.
The Crown Prosecution Service had been told that Cheshire Constabulary wanted to consider the validity of the statistical evidence again in the case. The prosecutor decided that he didn't want that line of inquiry and instructed the police not to pursue the avenue any further at present.
If that prosecuting lawyer had said to the police, don't do that, don't get that evidence from them, had given an instruction, that might be a disciplinary offence. But if that had been done deliberately in order to prevent the information that Dr. Hunton could have given to a jury, if that potentially had happened, there could be very, very serious implications as far as that's concerned.
Is that criminal, potentially?
Potentially, it could be a criminal act. We don't know, because we don't know the full scenario of that situation. But if somebody within an investigation is trying to prevent evidence which is relevant and which should be put to a jury from coming into the investigation, that's a really big issue.
The Crown Prosecution Service decided to ignore the warning, which the UK Parliament had on the human cost and damage to public confidence in the criminal justice system caused by the miscarriage of justice associated with flawed statistical evidence.
It's called the prosecutor's fallacy and so on and so on.
Unlike the botched cases of Sally Clark and Lucia de Burke, Lucy Letby's prosecution never used a number to say how unlikely it all was to have happened by chance. Something specific, like 1 in 342 million. Since Lucy's trial, some involved in the prosecution, such as the chief expert witness Dowie Evans, claimed that meant they were not doing statistics.
The case had nothing to do with statistics, and I'm not quite sure how many ways you can tell statisticians that the case had nothing to do with statistics.
The King's Counsel in his opening speech said, "What's the chance of that? What's the coincidence?" If you're using the word coincidence, it's a striking coincidence, you are implying something like less than 1 in 1,000 or less than 1 in 1,000,000. I've had a senior judge saying there was no statistics, so there wasn't a p-value. Lawyers would not like me to define what is or isn't law, and to pretend because you avoid 1 or 2 particular words you are not using statistics is a feat of, I think, either intellectual dishonesty or intellectual stupidity or ignorance.
With the trial date pushed back to October, in August 2022, battle lines were drawn at Chilworth Manor near Southampton. 4 of the prosecution experts met with 2 from the defence. Although defence neonatologist Mike Hall had more recent high-level experience than his prosecution counterpart Sandy Bowen, the defence were numerically outgunned.
The experts are expensive, they're often quite technical, they often bore the jury to tears when they're on the stand. So if you can actually have a pre-trial meeting and say, look, we all agree on this and we don't agree on that, that makes it easier, the judge is pre-warned, etc. And so some of them got together in a meeting before the trial started. So there were marked areas of disagreement, particularly over the air injections, either into stomach or vein. The nature of the rashes Michael was pretty good on.
But there were areas of agreement among prosecution and defence. All noted disappointment that Dr. Ravi Jairam hadn't thought to mention those wildly unusual skin rashes for 17 months after he supposedly saw them. But the other area of agreement was infinitely more important. Insulin.
In 1991, 22-year-old Alit murdered 4 children and attacked 9 others in her care.
Cheshire Police and the CPS knew that it was insulin tests that had convicted Beverly Alit in 1993.
We knew that blood had been taken on the 3rd collapse, and the insulin level was quite high.
They'd got pretty good evidence that something was going wrong.
but nothing that they could absolutely guarantee proved that any of the children that had been harmed had been deliberately harmed.
Vincent Marks then carried out confirmatory tests.
We were able to show that Paul had an astronomically high level of insulin in his blood.
Cheshire Police had had their insulin test results since February 2018. But if this was the same smoking gun as Beverly Allitt, where it took just 2 years from crime to conviction, why had it taken over 2.5 years to even charge Lucy Letby? Perhaps the answer was there were no follow-up tests done at all. And the test they did do came with a label that effectively says, "Not for forensic use." The tests were not even good enough for an Olympic athlete to be stripped of a gold medal.
The lab had written back to them saying this is suggestive of exogenous insulin, but you need to do the confirmatory test at Guildford. You need to do the mass spectrometry, and they didn't do it because they didn't suspect it at the time in either of these babies. So they knew that they had some evidence that was suggestive of exogenous insulin, but it wasn't a knockout blow, and probably not good enough for a trial unless you could get a high-ranking expert who looked at it and said, no, I think this is definitively, beyond any reasonable doubt, exogenous insulin, and that's what they got in Professor Peter Hindmarsh.
While Peter Hindmarsh and Sandy Bowen would both come under intense scrutiny in the years ahead, at Chilworth Manor, things were very different.
Bowen and Hindmarsh said, yes, we think this is exogenous insulin, very unlikely to have been accidental, therefore likely to be deliberate. And this is where we know definitively from the minutes of that meeting. Michael said, I'm not an insulin expert, I defer to Professor Hindmarsh. And the defence paediatric endocrinologist who said, I agree with Professor Hindmarsh. And so that's where it was definitively stated that the defence pretty much agreed with the prosecution over insulin. All the pre-trial meeting was give a go-ahead for the prosecution to say, look, we can absolutely hammer home the insulin cases and then everything else will follow.
It's a fair start.
Not even Lucy's own witnesses would point out that cheap insulin test results were not reliable enough to strip a gold medal from an international athlete.
Absolutely incredible!
With just 2 weeks to go, the Royal Statistical Society released their report. But by that point, no one was doing statistics. Although, speaking just after the trial, it seems Paul Hughes didn't get the memo.
Our statistical analysis showed that Lucy Letby had present everything.
After the statisticians were ignored. After the defence failed to find anyone who seemingly knew anything about neonatal insulin. After an investigation apparently riddled with confirmation bias. After waiting 2 years in jail for one of the largest murder trials in British history, being represented by the duty solicitor who happened to be on duty after her first arrest. Lucy Letby likely never knew that her 10-month trial was almost certainly over before it even began.